gentle, and of course very modern apes, today we are going to be discussing a very strange hominin, one that I have become more closely acquainted with thanks to taking a hominin evolution course right now this semester. I'm a graduate student, and so I now have the opportunity to take a graduate level hominin evolution course under some very successful and active researchers in the field right now. And this hominin is confusing even to them. I mean this very seriously. We don't really know what the hell is going on with this thing. So before we begin, allow me to set the stage. Hominin evolution likely began around 7 million years ago with the likes of Sahelanthropus chilensis. For the next 3 to 4 million years, hominins would be upright walkers with some remaining commitments to the trees. With anterior foramen magnums, more bowl-shaped pelvises, and leg morphologies more similar to humans, these guys differed greatly from the other Miocene apes that came before. This group of early apes, like I said, includes Sahelanthropus chilensis, Aurantuganensis, and both species of Ardipithecus, Ardipithecus cadaba and Ardipithecus ramidus. Canine size is also decreasing, a trait that would continue into the later hominins. These super early hominins were characterized by their primitive faces and brains, clocking in no greater than a modern chimp, ranging around 300 to 380 cc's, but again, their bipedal nature. Ardipithecus ramidus is the best represented of the group with a wealth of fossil material attributed to it, including a fantastic skeleton. We'll discuss more about these guys when I get there on my Wild Tale of Human Evolution series, eventually. The world was succeeded by the Australopithecines, first Australopithecus anamensis at 4.2 million years ago, and then the classic Australopithecus afarensis or Lucy at 3.7 million years ago. Bigger brains, flatter faces, and even smaller canines characterize these guys in comparison to the hominins that came before, and these trends would continue into both descendant genera, Paranthropus and Homo. Australopithecines still had brains that were small-ish, but larger than what came before, ranging from around 450 cc's to 550 cc's, larger than a modern chimp's, but still nowhere near modern humans. Their faces, though, are flat compared to ancient and modern non-human apes. The canines of Australopithecines are small and non-projecting, and they've even lost their canine-honin complex. Their postcrania are definitively bipedal when on the ground. All Australopithecines had a valgus knee, anterior foramen magnum, inline big toes, or helices, and bowl-shaped pelvises with sagittally oriented iliac blades. Most of the Australopithecines would be succeeded by the genera Paranthropus and Homo. Paranthropus is one strange dude. It's bipedal, like the Australopithecines, and the brain hovers around 500 to 550 cc's, but these guys are unique in many ways as well. Our strange cousins have enormous molars and molarized premolars, large and forwardly placed zygomatics, and males have a sagittal crest, much like male gorillas. Genus Homo, our own genus, slowly grew the brain case size over time and generally shrunk the teeth and jaws. Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis range from 509 to 825 cc's. Homo erectus sensu lato, or generally speaking, had an enormous range, with Homo georgicus at 546 cc's to 790 cc's, Homo ergaster ranging from 750 cc's to 909 cc's, and Homo erectus sensu stricto, or in a more limited sense, at around a 1000 cc average. Obviously, our own species represents a large brain at around 1200 to 1400 cc's, and our cousins, Homo neanderthalensis, average higher, around 1500 cc's, and maxing out at around 1700 cc's. Oddball members of our genus who lived more recently defy the trend of growing brains, with the diminutive Homo floresiensis at 426 cc's and the apish Homo naledi ranging from 400 to 600 cc's. The family tree is packed, and it's diverse. But squeezed into that time period between the Australopithecines and their descendants, we have a very strange hominin indeed. Its name is Kenyanthropus platyops. The name means flat-faced man from Kenya, and it's found in the Lake Turkana region of Kenya, specifically at this site called Lomekwi. Let's look for a moment at the paper which was released detailing sort of the diagnostic characteristics of Kenyanthropus platyops. What exactly makes it distinct? Why does it deserve not only its own species, but a brand spanking new genus? So, new place, new time here. I thought this would actually be a better way to do it, so this is how we're going to do it. So here's the original paper that kind of described Kenyanthropus platyops, and right away you see the generic diagnosis. So here's why they think it gets to have its own genera. And mostly they're going to list a lot of traits that are of degree, like it's not the presence of a brand new structure, it's more like the face is flatter, right? The zygomatico-alveolar crest is low and curved, and they're going to make a pretty good point for it that Kenyanthropus platyops is indeed unique from other hominins that have different genera. So they make a case here where it differs from Australopithecines in the sort of derived morphology of the lower face, the subnasal prognathism, the sagittally and transversely flat nasoalveolar clivus, so that's this area right here underneath the nose, kind of where your gums are. Anteriorly positioned maxillary zygomatic process, the size of various teeth, and then they're going to say here's how it differs sort of from Paranthropus aethiopicus with genus Paranthropus, Paranthropus boisei and Paranthropus robustus, and how it differs from genus Homo. So that's why they're saying it doesn't belong in any of these genera. It can't be an Australopithecine because of XYZ. It can't be Paranthropus. It can't be Homo. So we're going to give it a brand new genus, Kenyanthropus platyops. So as you scroll down, you'll see that it gets a sort of a cranial description. Here's the list of other hominin specimens from Lomekwi and Cataboy. And then they go down and they have a sort of table where they are comparing the cranial features of Paranthropus, Homo rudolfensis, and then Kenyanthropus platyops. And what you're going to see here, and we're going to kind of go over it here in a second, is that generally speaking, Kenyanthropus platyops, according to this description, shares more with Homo rudolfensis than it does with Paranthropus boisei. And we're going to go over a few of these traits now, but what you really need to know is the case that they're making for Kenyanthropus platyops is that it's got a flat face, which links it with Homo rudolfensis, and it's got small molars, which links it with Homo rudolfensis, because I don't know if you guys know this, but Paranthropus has big, old molars. Paranthropus molars. Hold on, I'm just going to show you here in a sec. Big spanking molars. Here is Paranthropus, the maxilla of Paranthropus. There's the palate, here's the tooth row, and what you should immediately see is that the molars are freaking gigantic compared to Homo sapiens, which is here on the right. So down here's Paranthropus boisei, Nutcracker Man. You're gonna see that in sort of a second. This guy right here, we're gonna look at it in detail. But back over to the paper. As we look at these traits, I want you to keep something in mind, which is that here is the specimen of Kenyanthropus platyops, KNNWT 40,000. It has been blown to smithereens. This is actually because of the nature of its taphonomy. So unlike most fossils, which are preserved in sort of different kinds, non-clay sediments, I guess I should say, non-clay, this guy has been effectively exploded due to how this clay has been exposed to temperature changes and inundation and things like that over time. That's a pretty big far cry from the likes of, that's a Homo sapiens, there's Kenyanthropus platyops in 3D model, but the likes of Paranthropus boisei or Homo rudolfensis, which you can see here, which are more or less in one piece, and they're like pretty complete. Not to say Kenyanthropus platyops isn't complete, it's certainly complete, it's just been blown to pieces. So let's discuss Kenyanthropus platyops. So there are a couple of traits here. As you can see, upper molar size, it links it more with Homo rudolfensis because the upper molar of this specimen of KNMWT 40,000 is like, it's itty bitty. There's only one molar though, sort of still in the jaw. The rest of the teeth have been lost in that one major specimen. It's got thick enamel, but not as thick as Paranthropus. It's got a thin palate, which is what we'll see in that sort of area of early Homo. The nasoalveolar clivus, this is pretty critical, is not guttered. So here's a human. The nasoalveolar clivus is this area again of sort of where your gums are underneath the nose. Here is Kenyanthropus platyops exploded. We're not going to use this version. Here's Paranthropus boisei. What you should see is directly under the nasal aperture, there's this gutter, right? This kind of divot, which is weird. We don't have that, and only Paranthropus seems to have that. Homo rudolfensis, which is the hominin that the authors, the Leakeys, are linking Kenyanthropus platyops to, no guttered nasoalveolar clivus. Nothing like that. And then here's a better sort of reconstructed 3D model of Kenyanthropus platyops. You might be thinking, okay, how did they reconstruct it? This was actually, a paper was done at least on the reconstruction of the maxilla. And the way that they reconstructed Kenyanthropus platyops is they shoved that bad boy into a CT scanner, and then they reconstructed it digitally in probably something like Eviso, a program that lets you kind of put it back together, Humpty Dumpty style. But what you'll see is that there is no guttering under the in the nasoalveolar clypeus. It's just flat, like normal style. In fact, even if you go to the OG original exploded version, which as you can see here, the orbits here and here, and then there's the nasal aperture, and when you spin it to the side, no guttering. So even if you don't reconstruct it, there's no guttering there. They talk a little bit about things like the malar regions. The malar region is tall and it's wide in Paranthropus. It's tall in Kenyanthropus platyops and Homo rudolfensis. The malar region, for the record, is sort of this area underneath the eyes down to where the maxilla starts, which would be down here. And as you can see, it's pretty tall in Homo rudolfensis, whereas in Paranthropus boisei, it's wide because they've got these big, massive zygomatics, which are these cheekbones that you can see here. In a human, sort of the same situation, more tall than it is wide, this malar region right here, right? Here's the width, here's the length, or I guess the height, you would say. But overall, when we're looking at the different traits of Kenyanthropus platyops as they've reconstructed it here, it does seem to be linking more with Homo rudolfensis. And the critical parts are going to be the face is flat, it's not dished like you see in Paranthropus, and it's not prognathic. So dishing would be like if I could somehow, please, get Paranthropus boisei, this model is like busted, to do a profile view, you'll see that there's this dishing, like you've almost taken an ice cream scooper to it. And compared to something like Homo rudolfensis, which is very flat, right, you would compare like a flat versus a dished midface to something that's more prognathic or snowy, like what you would see in a chimp, right? Chimpanzees have a big snout. We don't. And neither does genus Homo. And according to the authors, neither does Kenyanthropus, right? It's much flatter. And because this thing is dated from 3 to 3.5 million years ago, that's pretty old to be displaying a flat face. It's certainly flatter than what we see in some of the Australopithecines. So what you should hopefully be seeing is that they're trying to make the link, right? Kenyanthropus platyops might be the ancestor of Homo instead of any member of Australopithecus. This is what's kind of being alluded to. So if you scroll down a little more, they got that nice picture. There it is. There's the original specimen. And they've got the stratigraphy. First of the stratigraphy is down here. And that's how they date it using volcanic tuffs in order to get that range of 3 to 3.5 million years ago. Here's where they compare molar area, and there's the poor little sad K&M WT 40,000. It's small in any kind of molar dimension, which is pretty bonkers. It's like teeny tiny. And basically all of this is how they get to the conclusion that Kenyanthropus platyops is different enough from all of these other genera that it needs its own genera, and it also deserves its own species. So they finish by saying over here that the findings point to an early diet-driven adaptive radiation, providing new insight from the association of hominin craniodental features and having implication of our understanding of the Pleistocene hominin phylogeny. So let's start to get into some of the problems, because as they present it here, they make a pretty good case. Like, yeah, there's this hominin, it's living in Lomekwi in the Lake Turkana region, and it's got a flat face. Maybe it's a better candidate than some of the Australopithecines to lead to early Homo. But there's some problems, right? One half of that hominin, that early Homo rudolfensis sort of diagnosis, is based on the flat face, and the other is based off of the small molar. Those are the two biggies, right, that connect it to Homo rudolfensis, not that remove it from Paranthropus. And the main issue is that here's K&M WT 40,000, and here is another jaw that was found at the site. And what I hope should stick out to you is that the molars are big, not small. This has not been officially assigned to Kenyanthropus platyops. So that leads us to this. Here's my little whiteboard here to show you kind of what I'm thinking. So we've got Lomekwi, that's the site. We've got K&M WT 40,000, that's the skull. And then we've got some mandibles, right? And the mandibles show big old molars. Kenyanthropus platyops is, in this skull diagnosis here, has itty bitty teeny tiny molars. And by molars, I mean molar. The molar is the only tooth that's still in the jaw, that's still in the maxilla, rather. It's the only one. So I don't know necessarily that we can say that these mandibles aren't actually a part of Kenyanthropus platyops, and therefore this is just an example of a small molared specimen. and thus 1/2 of the diagnosis as its own genus and also 1/2 of the tie to the later Homo rudolfensis is gone. In fact, the molar size ties it more to Paranthropus. Uh-oh, what are we doing here? That's a problem. And the problem for Kenyanthropus platyops actually gets worse. So, Tim White, famed anatomist and discoverer of Ardipithecus ramidus, which is one of my favorite hominins, kind of responded to this KNMWT 40,000 fossil with his own manuscript titled Early Hominids, Diversity or Distortion. And I'm not going to show the paper. I have access to it through my university, but Tim can be a little, I don't know that he's litigious, but he can be kind of weird about fossils, so I feel weird like sharing his work without his permission, and I really didn't want to reach out to Tim White for just a video on YouTube. So instead I'm just going to use publicly accessible versions of it, but you can see here's the paper titled Early Hominids, Diversity or Distortion, and here are some figures from within it. And in it, Tim kind of goes over some problems that he sees. He noted that there are some fossil critters called oreodonts, which were these little pig-like relatives that lived in North America, and that they were kind of deformed in a similar way to Kenyanthropus platyops. And what I mean by deformed is they were, in the same kind of diagnosable sediments that caused them to basically explode in their sort of formation while they were forming, or rather after they formed, when exposed to certain, things like, I imagine, heat and water inundation, stuff like that. So you can see the oreodont normal skull here, and here's what an oreodont skull looks like when exposed to similar diagnostic characteristics as Kenyanthropus platyops, and then here it is even further. I don't think Kenyanthropus platyops is as bad as C here, but I do think that it looks very similar to B, sort of what I'm highlighting with my cursor. And they've got this nice little box down here that really closes up and is like, look, it's very, very similar. So Tim basically says, we can't say that Kenyanthropus platyops, that at least its facial prognathism, remember we already talked about the molar problem, but that its facial prognathism is necessarily legit, because as you can see with this oreodont, it is slightly deformed. There's this little divot here in sort of the rostrum that was, less divoted in the original specimen, or in an undisturbed specimen. And so Tim's like, this just could potentially be an issue. We can't jump the gun here. It may be that Kenyanthropus platyops wasn't as deformed as this oreodont, and even then the oreodont really isn't. I don't think that you could look at this oreodont and say, that it's not an oreodont, right? I think that the situation with Kenyanthropus is more, we need to be aware of the possibility. But Tim also raises a second question. He shows these two bonobos, right? So you've got two female bonobos on the top and on the bottom, and these are both bonobos. You'll notice that they do show a wide variety of morphologies. This is called intraspecific variation, or variation within the species. And, what I can kind of hope you appreciate is that if there's any level of deformation going on with Kenyanthropus platyops here, it may push it into the variation that we see for normal Australopithecines, potentially. That's what Tim is arguing. Now, again, when we go over and look at Kenyanthropus platyops here, I don't know whether or not the morphology here has been deformed to the degree that it's literally looking like a different species when really it's just an Australopithecine. I suspected initially that was a possibility. But then, allow me to take my, so I presented the argument for Kenyanthropus platyops being a legit genus and species, and then I presented a knockdown for that, where I was like, the molar is actually maybe just a small specimen, and maybe it's distorted because of the type of deformation that's going on here. Now allow me to present a counter argument, and this one is by our friend Fred Spoor. You may remember Fred Spoor because he was an author on the original Kenyanthropus platyops paper, as you can see there. So let's get into this. So Fred Spoor, in his abstract here, he notes that basically what he's done is he's taken the mandible, KNMWT 40,000's mandible, maxilla, the KNMWT 40,000 maxilla, and he stuck it into a CT scanner, and then he reconstructed it like painstakingly piece by piece to really see if this thing is unique. And what he comes to the conclusion of is that computed tomography, scans and detailed preparation of the maxilla enabled comprehensive assessment of the postmortem changes so that he could, basically account for things like what Tim White was complaining about, so deformation. This is a significantly later paper. This is in 2010. And he says so that landmark data characterizing of the morphology can be corrected for distortion. Based on a substantially larger comparative sample than previously available, the results of the statistical analysis show that KNM WT40,000 is indeed significantly different from and falls outside of the known range of variation of species for Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and the contemporary Australopithecus afarensis in particular. So this is like, hey Tim, you're wrong, and here's why. These results support the attribution of KNM WT40,000 to a separate species, and the notion that hominin taxonomic diversity in Africa extends back well into the Middle Pliocene. So let's take a look at some of his work here. Here's where he's sort of getting ready to do a comparison of Australopithecus afarensis and Kenyanthropus platyops. So what he's done here is really important because reconstructing something is tough and there's a level of bias to it. But that being said, landmarks can eliminate a lot of this bias. What landmarks are is basically like where something is with regard and with relation to something else, and that makes it very difficult to put your own spin on it, if you will, because things have to be in sort of a geometrically, biomechanically in the case of locomotion, feasible way. They have to be put together in a feasible way. So that should lend some confidence here. And what you can see is that when you're looking at the parallel 3D reconstructions of Australopithecus afarensis and Kenyanthropus platyops with these sort of 5 landmarks, they're different, right? They are different in how they compare with their morphology. And he goes on to look at other aspects of KNM WT40,000. He examines molars. He does comparisons in sort of principal component analyses. And his conclusion, as you saw in the abstract, is that these things are different. If we're looking just at the maxilla, it does seem like Kenyanthropus platyops like falls out of the range for Australopithecus afarensis. This seems pretty sound to me as far as busting Tim White's argument. Spohr kind of finishes his analysis here by saying, in all, the analyses confirm the occurrence of 3 different facial patterns among early hominins considered here. Australopithecus is characterized by prognathic, so snouty, and transversely, so across the middle, curved subnasal areas, combined with posteriorly positioned zygomatics, so that's the swept back zygomatics, not the pushed forward ones we see in Paranthropus. So let me just show you what I mean there real quick. So Paranthropus has these zygomatics that are just really, really intense. These big old cheekbones that are wide and pushed forward. Humans, on the other hand, have zygomatics that sweep backwards, more like Australopithecines. But let's see how Kenyanthropus is characterized. Paranthropus by prognathic, transversely flat subnasal area with anteriorly positioned zygomatics, and Kenyanthropus by a more orthognathic or flatter face, transversely flat subnasal area with anteriorly positioned zygomatics. So this is really weird though, right? Spohr's paper is talking about facial patterns in 3 kind of early hominin genera, but let's go back to Lomekwi, right? The place where we've got the material itself. So if this is Kenyanthropus platyops, right, this KNM WT40,000, then these mandibles, at least according to Spohr here, like they might not be Kenyanthropus platyops. That would suggest that there are 2 hominins present at Lomekwi. And then Australopithecus afarensis is also milling around East Africa at this time. Did Australopithecus make it to Lomekwi? Is that who the mandibles belong to? A derivative of Australopithecus afarensis? Some kind of Australopithecine? Or is this actually, do these mandibles just fall into the range of Kenyanthropus that isn't represented just by the maxilla? What the heck is going on here, right? And I'm going to blow your mind even a little bit more because Lomekwi has stone tools that are dated to 3.3 million years ago. So that same time period of KNM WT40,000 and whoever the mandibles belong to. So something very weird is going on at Lomekwi. We either have 1 or 2 hominins, and one or perhaps even both of them are making stone tools. That's insane. These are the oldest stone tools that we know of. So here's some pictures of them. As you can see, it's in situ cores. They talk about the flakes. Both the core and the flake display a series of dispersed percussive marks on the cortex showing percussive activities occurred before the removal of the flake, potentially indicating the block was used for different purposes. This is very similar to what we see of like sort of very basic stone tools by different critters today, but albeit a little bit more advanced, right? This is like Oldowan style, but like maybe even pre-Oldowan. This is weird. What the heck is going on? This may be a mystery that only finding more fossils at Lomekwi will solve. But what we do know for sure is that there were hominins present at the site, and these hominins were certainly making stone tools, whoever they were. So what do you think of Kenyanthropus platyops? To quote my professor, is it a contender or just a pretender?